Good afternoon, members of the court, defense, and the state. Jury service is very important as I stand here in front of you and deliver this important message in regards to the case. Make sure to base your verdict on facts and testimony. We appreciate you as the jury. We know that many of you took time off work, of your personal time to be here. And we as the court appreciate your effort in being here to make the right choice in this case. The defendant, Ms. Marsha Jones, was married to Elmer Jones for 8 years. Like any couple that gets married falls in love. They wanted to live a happy and beautiful life. Now, 6 months ago, their lives turned upside down. And it's very unfortunate because now there's a human life that has perished. And I want you guys of the jury to please make a great decision based on the evidence that is going to be provided. As I stand here and I look in each and every one of us, our lives can be unpredictable overnight. Murder for Marsha Jones, it was not intentional. It was not premeditated. Marsha Jones feared for her life. Elmer Jones came home with liquor. And Miss Marsha Jones was fearful of her life. Elmer Jones began to punch her in the stomach. And as I stand here for you, can we all think about how a person feels when they're being punched in the stomach repeatedly? And this is a 5', 120 pounds. That is the height and weight of the defendant. Mr. Elmer Jones was 6'2", 210 pounds. Can we picture that moment of fear? Not knowing that the man she married was inflicting bodily harm on this woman that feared for her life. Not only was he punching her, but he actually threatened to kill her. And as I pause for a moment, is the reason why the defendant chose to use deadly force as a form of protection. Sometimes when we think of the justice system, we want to think of fairness. We want to paint a beautiful picket fence. And we want things to be perfect in a world that is not always perfect. The Joneses never imagined this tragic moment in their lives. But as I sit here and look at each and every one of the jury, we want you to hear the evidence. Write down some notes and come with a very great verdict based on facts, not opinions, the facts. And I want to make sure that as we make our verdict, if anyone feels that it was not reasonable and that it's unreasonable, it's important to outweigh the reasonable and unreasonable. Could our defendant, Marsha Jones, defend herself in another manner when you have someone of that height and weight? The actions say so much of what happened that night. Marsha Jones, our defendant, is count 1 murder. Was the defendant justifiable when she used self-defense? Sometimes we want to paint a picture and wonder how it would be. Just close your eyes and picture someone 6'2", 210 pounds on top of you, punching you. Our defendant didn't know what was going to happen that night. Study the evidence. Listen clearly to the testimony of the defendant and to the jury. Thank you for being here. Please apply the applicable laws for justice. The defendant did not act with malice. Murder is a killing with intent and malice. The defendant is not a murderer. There is 3 types of murder. First-degree murder, unlawful killing that is willful and premeditated. Miss Marsha Jones did not premeditate. If she could take back, she would not want her husband dead. She would not have shot twice the trigger and shoot her husband. Second-degree murder, unpremeditated but intentional killing of another, which is a more serious than manslaughter and lesser charge than first-degree murder. Third-degree murder, person is provoked and kills in the heat of an argument, fight, or heat of passion. It is usually used in self-defense. And this is the weapon that was used. And that's because Elmer Jones was a guard at the county jail. He showed his wife, our defendant, how to shoot a gun for protection. 8 years of marriage, and she put up with years of abuse, pain. She possibly was losing her mind in fear, didn't know who to talk to, didn't know who to trust with this kind of information. It's not the kind of information that you just pick up the phone and tell your neighbor, your friend, oh, my husband is beating me up every night. My husband comes home intoxicated. He forces me. This kind of information, you want to keep your marriage private at times. And that's the kind of person our defendant was, a private woman, hardworking woman who loved her husband. I'm sure our defendant will take back everything that has happened. Murder with malice is a forethought. It's a mental state requirement for a person to be liable of a crime, first and second degree murder. That's by California law. And the things we know about the defendant, she pled for her life. Please stop. No, stop. And Elmer Jones had a bad habit of assault and battery on our defendant. And the abuse was never reported. And the evidence prior to the death, Elmer Jones often came home intoxicated, argued with his wife, our defendant, by beating her up and threatening her life. Elmer Jones, as I mentioned, was 6 foot 2 inches in height. Please make note of that. And our defendant, 5 foot 4 inches. So there's a big slight difference. The defendant pled for her life, ran into her room, and grabbed the gun and fired 2 times. She pulled the trigger 2 times. We can't even imagine what our defendant was feeling at that time. I'm sure if her husband would not have assaulted her and threatened her, this would not be happening. And if she felt the need to pull a gun, was for her defense, her plea for her life, not to kill her husband, not to kill the man she loved. 2 bullets entered. 1 bullet went through his chest and through his nipple. The second bullet went through the left rib cage. And this is the night of the argument. And as you have heard the evidence and you wonder, what possibly could our defendant be thinking about and worrying? Self-defense is the right to use as a legal reason for the use of force in fear of danger or someone inflicting bodily harm. Bodily harm was inflicted on our defendant. Marsha Jones to be convicted not guilty. She was assaulted multiple times by her husband for years. Trauma, fear, deception, depression, anxiety, all mental states when you're abused by the man or the spouse you love. And as you hear the evidence, there is also domestic violence laws as presented. Penal Code 275.5, inflicting injury on an intimate partner is a valid legal defense. 3rd degree, person is provoked and kills the heat of an argument, fight, or heat of a passion, often used in self-defense. Our defendant use of excessive force, deadly force, is justifiable. She had reason to believe that a threat exists and the killing was justifiable. But it was not intended and it was not premeditated. Count 1 murder, the defendant feared for her life. Defendant did not act with malice, as malice is a forethought. Murder is a killing with intent and malice. Marsha Jones, our defendant, is not a murderer. Self-defense is the right to use as a legal form for use of force and fear of danger of someone inflicting bodily injury. And in this case, her husband was the aggressor. Her husband was the one inflicting bodily injury. And now there's a life gone. There's a woman also, as I look at you, our jury, there's a woman also crying for the loss of her husband. Her intentions were not to kill him. It was to protect herself. If she could go back in time, I could guarantee you our defendant would not have pulled the trigger. Defendant felt imminent danger of physical harm for the beatings and the threats that Elmer Jones inflicted upon her. Our defendant was scared, and as she pulled the trigger twice. And her penal code 243 for domestic battery. Penal code 240 is assault. The reason, belief that threats exist and a reason for killing is justifiable. Our domestic violence laws. And take note of this. Marsha Jones, our defendant, is not a murderer. It was a valid legal defense. Not guilty on count 1 murder. The flannel doctrine is also known as imperfect self-defense. Fear of being killed, accuser kills another person, jury agrees. Charge drops to involuntary manslaughter. It applies when accused kills another person and need to use deadly force in self-defense. The accused believed she feared for being killed and suffered bodily injury. The jury can agree that the defendant acted with imperfect self-defense. California CalCrim number 505, right to self-defense. Justifiable homicide, self-defense or defense of another. The defendant is not guilty of murder or attempted manslaughter. The defendant believed there was imminent danger. And as you hear me repeat, imminent danger, fear. This woman was beaten multiple times. And as we don't know why it was never reported, it kept going and going and going for years. Now we have a death. As I repeat myself, Marsha Jones, our defendant, is not a criminal. She did not murder Elmer Jones, her husband. She is currently hurting for his death. As I ask you to consider our testimony, consider the evidence, all this happened because her husband, Elmer Jones, was upset because there was a messy home. He came home from work tired to a messy home and chooses to inflict harm on his wife. Here's the Heights. Big difference. And I know that our jury will make the right choice and the right decision, and a verdict will be set. I thank you for being here. Thank you to the members of the court. This is our closing argument on the People versus Marsha Jones, case number 1234567, Penal Code 187. Marsha Jones, our defendant, is not a murderer.